The first time I realized everything I believed about love could shatter in a single evening. I was standing in the rain, staring at his empty driveway, the sound of the drops against the asphalt louder than my own heartbeat. I told myself he was stuck, delayed, caught up in something mundane. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I had been waiting for someone who was no longer mine to wait for. Before we move on, I need to be honest with you. My heart sank when I saw that 99% of you watch my videos but don't subscribe. It truly means the world when you do. It helps stories like this find the people who need them. So please take a second to subscribe. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing your locations. It reminds me that stories really do connect us, no matter where we are. If stories like this remind you how fragile love and trust can be, subscribe, because every untold truth deserves to be heard. The first time I saw him, I was late. The gym smelled of cold metal and polished wood, a scent so sharp it made the air feel alive, electric. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead felt like it was underscoring every heartbeat, every footstep that echoed against the floor. He didn't speak at first, just watched me through eyes that seemed to measure everything. The way I carried my weight, the tension in my shoulders, the hesitation in my steps. I remember wondering for just a moment if he saw me at all, or if I was nothing more than an inconvenience in his perfectly ordered world. Then he spoke. Just a single sentence, simple, commanding. Start over. Now. His voice didn't raise, didn't shout, but it cut through the air like a knife, precise and deliberate. I obeyed. There was no room to think, no time to question. I felt the sweat on my palms, the ache in my muscles, the sting of failure press against every nerve. And still I couldn't look away from him. The way he moved among the others was effortless, deliberate, almost predatory in a way that made my chest tighten without warning. He corrected my stance, adjusted my grip, guided me through repetition after repetition, until the ache in my body became an obsession in my mind. I noticed the small things, the subtle tilt of his head when I faltered, the brief lift of an eyebrow when I succeeded, the quiet hum of satisfaction that lingered after a perfect form. It was in these small, fleeting moments that something shifted. Discipline was no longer just about the exercises. It was about him, about how his presence reshaped the air around me, how every correction, every instruction, demanded something from me I hadn't realized I was capable of giving. By the end of that first session, my body trembled, exhaustion leaving my muscles quivering and my breath ragged. But my mind was wide awake. Something about the way he had held me accountable, the way he had watched me fail and then succeed, left a residue I couldn't shake. I was dizzy not just from exertion, but from attention. His attention, precise and unwavering, that felt both punishing and intoxicating. And in that dizziness, I felt the faintest stirrings of a dangerous thought. What if I wanted more of this? More of his scrutiny, more of his presence, more of the electricity that seemed to hum between us when no one else was watching? Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of training became a ritual. Early mornings bled into late evenings, my body molding itself around his expectations. Each push, each sprint, each drop of sweat became a thread weaving me closer to him, closer to a line I wasn't sure I wanted to cross, but couldn't seem to resist approaching. He had a way of speaking to me that made me believe in my own strength, while simultaneously making me doubt the very foundations of my resolve. His words lingered in my mind long after the gym was empty, echoing when I showered alone, when I ate in silence, when I lied awake listening to the distant hum of city life outside my window. And yet, it wasn't just the physical discipline that held me captive. It was the subtle intimacies he had woven into our routines, the way he corrected me with a hand that lingered a heartbeat too long, the way his gaze found mine when no one else was looking, the way he smiled at small victories as if he alone had the power to approve them. I told myself it was nothing. It was professional. It was mentorship. But deep inside, I felt a tremor every time our hands brushed, a flutter every time his eyes held mine just a second longer than necessary. It was a dangerous attention, a current I couldn't escape. And the more I tried to rationalize it, the more tightly it gripped me. I remember one evening, after a session that had left my lungs burning and my legs shaking, he said quietly, almost like he was confessing something, "You're stronger than you think. You just don't believe it yet." I nodded, breathless, my chest heaving, sweat slick on my skin. But in the pit of my stomach, I realized that the strength he spoke of wasn't just physical. It was something far more insidious, an awakening, a shift that I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I felt exposed, like he could see the small, hidden fissures inside me that no one else had ever noticed, and the fear of being seen mixed strangely with relief. By the end of that month, I was no longer just attending sessions. I was counting the hours until I could be in that space again, until I could hear his voice, until I could feel the weight of his gaze measuring me in ways no mirror could. I didn't admit it to anyone, not even to myself. I told myself it was admiration, respect, the natural bond of teacher and student. But late at night, when I traced the outlines of my own body in the dim light of my apartment, I couldn't deny the truth. I was entangled in something that had begun as discipline and had already crept into desire. And somewhere, in the quiet hours before sleep, I wondered if I would survive the temptation I hadn't yet acknowledged but already feared. It began with small things, almost nothing, really. A glance that lingered too long, a brush of fingers that felt accidental but was too precise to be random. The gym had become a theater, each session a silent choreography between us, where every movement, every adjustment, carried a meaning I wasn't meant to see yet couldn't unsee. I told myself it was professional, that I was imagining it, that desire couldn't possibly survive in the fluorescent-lit air of instruction and repetition. But it did. It lived there, quiet and patient, growing like a shadow at the edge of consciousness. I remember the afternoon he lingered by my side, explaining a complex movement. His voice was low, steady, carrying over the hum of the treadmills and the distant clatter of weights. "Don't rush it," he said. "Let your body learn the rhythm." His hand brushed my shoulder, guiding me, just enough to make me pause, just enough to make me aware of the heat of his touch against my skin. I flinched, not out of fear but something closer to longing, a twitch of awareness that made my pulse trip over itself. My mind raced with excuses. I reminded myself that I had boundaries, that I was disciplined, that this was nothing more than training. And yet, when our eyes met in the mirror, the reflection between us seemed charged, private, impossible to articulate. Days bled into a dangerous intimacy. I found myself noticing him outside the gym, recalling the curve of his shoulders, the cadence of his voice, the way his presence made the air heavier and my chest tighter. There were moments when he would offer praise for a job well done, and I would feel the electricity of approval running through me like static. I knew it was a trap, knew that the more I allowed myself to feel, the less I could control the way he affected me. But it was addictive, the thrill of recognition, the pull of someone who saw me in ways no one else did, who demanded the best from me, yet offered an intimacy that felt forbidden. The first real moment of danger came in a quiet hallway after training. He leaned against the wall and I stopped just short, catching my breath from exhaustion. He said nothing at first, just studied me with a gaze that seemed to weigh every inch of me. And then, in a voice softer than I had ever heard from him, he said, "You're holding back." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" I asked, though my voice betrayed a tremor I couldn't hide. "From yourself," he said simply, and the words seemed to settle into my chest. I felt my heartbeat accelerate, the awareness of him brushing closer than necessary sending a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I could step away. But stepping away was impossible. The gravity between us had grown stronger than my caution, heavier than my judgment. It wasn't just the physical closeness that unnerved me. It was the intimacy of attention. He listened to my small complaints, remembered details about my life I hadn't spoken aloud, made observations that should have felt harmless but landed with a weight I couldn't ignore. He asked questions with a patience that felt tender, yet beneath it lay something else, an awareness, a probing, an understanding that unsettled me. I started to notice the way I anticipated him, how the day's routine revolved around seeing him, hearing him, performing under his gaze. I felt guilty, suffocated by guilt, yet compelled beyond reason. Every time I imagined what it would be like if I let myself lean into the attention, a heat would rise that left me breathless and trembling. The temptation grew in whispers, silent, cunning, appearing in fleeting moments that seemed insignificant until I realized I was counting them. The way his hand rested near mine when demonstrating a lift, the way his shadow would fall across mine during stretches, the way a single look could silence my mind for seconds I didn't have. I tried to rationalize, tried to rewrite my own reactions as professional admiration or gratitude. But I couldn't. The pull was undeniable. I was dancing on the edge of a line I didn't know I wanted to cross. And every warning bell in my mind clanged without effect. One night, after a grueling session that left me trembling from exertion and desire I refused to name, he said something I can't forget. Most people don't realize what they want until it's almost gone. I don't know if he was speaking to me, to himself, or to some unspoken tension in the air between us. But the words lodged in my chest like a splinter, impossible to remove, and for the first time I questioned whether I could resist the temptation he presented. I felt the first stirrings of betrayal, not yet of anyone else, but of the self I had thought steadfast, disciplined, unshakable. From that moment on, every session carried the risk of surrender. Every brush of his hand, every lingering glance, every whispered instruction became a battleground of desire and guilt. I tried to tell myself I was in control, that I could walk away, that I could maintain the discipline that had brought me this far. But control was an illusion. Desire had found a foothold, and it whispered to me constantly, coaxing me closer to a line I wasn't sure I could cross without shattering everything I thought I was. By the end of that chapter in my life, I was aware of a dangerous truth. The temptation wasn't just in his presence, it had grown inside me. It whispered in quiet moments, it haunted my reflection, it made my pulse race and my breath catch without warning. I was aware and yet powerless. The line between admiration and desire had blurred, and I was beginning to understand that the consequences of giving in might not be visible until it was far too late. It happened on an evening that began like any other, quiet and ordinary, the kind of day where the world feels safe because nothing remarkable has yet occurred. I remember the way the light fell across the apartment, golden and soft, as if warning me that even beauty could betray. I had trained earlier, pushed myself to exhaustion, and yet my mind was restless, replaying moments, glances, touches, words that lingered longer than they should. And then, without warning, everything unraveled. The first sign was a message. A notification that blinked on my phone, innocuous at first glance, but carrying a weight I had been avoiding. The words on the screen weren't mine to read. They were a confession, a revelation of something I had suspected but didn't want to acknowledge. My breath hitched. I read it twice, and each time my chest tightened as if someone had wrapped a coil of metal around it. A slow, suffocating panic settled over me, and I realized I had been blind, pretending discipline and desire were separate when they had always been entwined. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was a misunderstanding, that I could compartmentalize it and move forward. But the truth doesn't wait for convenient moments. By the time I looked at him, his expression was unreadable, calm, composed, but with a glimmer in his eyes that betrayed everything. The smile that once felt affirming now felt dangerous, predatory even. I wanted to ask, to demand, to make him explain, but the words lodged in my throat like splinters I couldn't remove. All I could do was stand there trembling, feeling the air itself become heavier with unspoken truths. It didn't take long for others to notice. Subtle shifts in tone, whispered exchanges, fleeting glances, all the things that once seemed harmless now carried accusations in their silence. I felt their eyes on me in the office, in the gym, on the street. I had been careful, meticulous even, but secrecy has a way of leaking into light, and suddenly every misstep, every choice I had made, felt exposed, fragile. I began to see the aftermath before it had even arrived, a storm looming that I had no power to stop. The guilt was immediate, suffocating. It pressed against my ribs, seeped into my bones, and left me restless and shaking. I had betrayed more than just trust. I had betrayed myself. I had convinced myself I was in control, that I could navigate desire without consequence. But now I was acutely aware of how fragile my carefully constructed boundaries had been. I replayed every moment in my mind, every smile, every touch, every whispered word, and with each recollection, the weight of responsibility pressed harder. How could I have been so naive? So foolish? Confrontations followed, some direct, others subtle. The people I had cared for, trusted, or even merely crossed paths with seemed to look at me differently. There were questions, accusations, hints of betrayal that didn't need to be voiced to wound. I wanted to explain, to justify, to argue that nothing had started with malice, but I knew the words would sound hollow. Actions speak louder than explanations, and mine had spoken volumes. In the mirror, I no longer recognized myself. The woman who had once been proud, disciplined, strong, was now fractured, haunted by desire and the consequences of indulging it. I remember sitting alone one night, the apartment dark except for the glow of the streetlights seeping through the blinds, feeling a hollowness that went deeper than exhaustion. I traced my fingers along the surface of the table, feeling the cold wood beneath my skin, and wondered if I had always been destined to stumble. Could I have stopped it? Could I have resisted? The questions didn't offer solace, only a relentless echo of self-recrimination. And yet beneath the despair, a small, fragile spark of clarity began to form. I had to face it, had to confront the choices I had made, even if the fallout threatened to consume everything I had once believed about myself. The storm arrived in waves. Some were quiet, silent glances, whispered suspicions. Others were loud and painful, conversations that left words hanging in the air like shards of glass. I felt exposed in every space I entered, as if the world itself had become a mirror reflecting my missteps. And with every encounter, the understanding deepened that there was no undoing the past, no erasing the desire that had grown between us, no reclaiming the innocence that had vanished the moment boundaries were blurred. Yet, amid the chaos, there was a strange clarity. I began to see patterns, motivations, truths that had been invisible to me before. The discipline he had taught me, once a source of pride, had also been the conduit through which temptation had entered my life. Every push, every command, every observation had been a thread, weaving me into a tapestry I hadn't realized I was helping create. And in that clarity, I understood the depth of my own complicity, not in a way that excused him, but in a way that forced me to confront my own desires, choices, and failures. By the end of those nights, I was hollowed but awake. I had been undone, yes, but I had also begun to understand the weight of truth, the inevitability of consequence, and the fragile boundary between desire and self-destruction. The reckoning had arrived, and I was forced to meet it fully, without excuses, without denial. And somewhere, in the quiet aftermath, I realized that survival would demand more than discipline, more than strength. It would demand honesty, with myself and with the world I had chosen to betray. By the time the world saw what I had tried to hide, I was already fractured. The revelation didn't explode in a single moment. It crept in, quiet as smoke, filling every corner of my life until nothing felt untouched. I could hear whispers even in rooms where no one spoke, feel judgment pressing against my back when I walked down the street, and see the subtle flicker of distrust in faces I had once counted on. It was as if the air itself had learned my secret, carrying it like a scent that refused to fade. The mirror became my harshest companion. Each morning I studied the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. The same eyes, the same lips, the same frame, yet everything inside felt unfamiliar. I traced the contours of my face as though hoping to find the old self beneath the surface. The disciplined, proud, unshakable version who had walked into the gym weeks ago without fear or complication. but she was gone, replaced by someone who carried desire and guilt as a single, inseparable weight. I caught myself wondering if she had ever existed at all, or if the person I had been was merely a fragile illusion I had worn until it could no longer survive the truth. The aftermath was not dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, and relentless. Conversations that should have been mundane felt charged with suspicion. Every interaction required careful calculation. Even those who didn't know the full story seemed to sense the fissures in my life, treating me with a kind of cautious distance that made my chest ache with loneliness. Trust became a fragile commodity, one I no longer had the luxury of distributing freely. I found myself withdrawing, not out of shame, but out of a visceral awareness that every word, every glance could be misinterpreted, and every misinterpretation could leave another crack in the fragile glass of my world. Regret became my constant companion. I replayed every decision, every choice, every touch, analyzing it as if I could somehow understand the moment I had crossed the line. And in that analysis, I discovered truths about myself that I hadn't wanted to face. My longing for attention, my susceptibility to subtle intimacies, my willingness to allow desire to override discipline. It was not a comforting discovery. It was painful, sharp, and disorienting. But it was necessary. Because if I refused to confront it, I would be doomed to repeat it, or worse, to carry the weight of it indefinitely without understanding. The people I had once relied on began to retreat, some silently, some with quiet confrontation. I don't think they fully understood my perspective or my inner turmoil, and I couldn't blame them. My actions had created ripples that extended far beyond my own intentions. I had been entangled in a web of secrecy and desire, and when the threads unraveled, they ensnared everyone nearby. Apologies felt hollow, explanations felt inadequate, and forgiveness, if it came, was tentative at best. I learned that some consequences cannot be fixed by words alone. They demand time, reflection, and sometimes distance. And yet, amid the ruins, there was a strange kind of clarity. I began to see myself as both victim and architect, someone who had been seduced by attention, but also someone who had allowed that seduction to take root. I began to understand that the lessons of discipline I had once cherished carried a duality I hadn't anticipated. They could forge strength, yes, but they could also carve pathways for vulnerability when wielded carelessly. I began to examine my own patterns, my own desires, my own failures with a harsh but necessary honesty, realizing that self-awareness was the first step toward any kind of redemption. Some nights, when the city was quiet, and the only sound was the hum of streetlights and my own uneven breathing, I would sit with the consequences, tracing them in my mind as if mapping a landscape I had never intended to navigate. I thought about the man who had taught me discipline, who had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, led me into temptation, and I wondered at the complexity of human influence. How much is our own choice, and how much is shaped by those around us? I could not answer, only reflect, only learn, only endure. In time, I began to rebuild. Slowly, painfully, deliberately, I learned to distinguish between attention that elevates and attention that ensnares. I learned to respect boundaries, both my own and those of others. I learned that trust is fragile and must be handled with care, but also that self-forgiveness, though harder to grasp, is vital. I am not the person I was when I walked into that gym. I am not the innocent, naive version who believed that discipline alone could protect her from desire. But I am alive. I am aware, and perhaps most importantly, I am capable of moving forward without denying the truths I have lived. The mirror still confronts me each day, but now I look into it with a measure of acceptance. I see the scars, yes, the fractures, the shadows of temptation and guilt. But I also see resilience. I see the woman who has endured, who has faced herself without flinching, who has learned that survival is not about perfection, but about honesty, courage, and the willingness to confront the parts of ourselves we most fear. The aftermath is not painless, nor is it finished, but it has become a teacher. showing me that even in the wake of desire and betrayal, it is possible to find rhythm again, to reclaim strength, and to rebuild a sense of self that is both human and unshakable. And as I close the door on what once was, I breathe, knowing that the story is not only about what was lost, but about what I have found in the shards.